The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the faint scent of floor cleaner in the air as Claire Thompson stepped into the bustling corporate lobby of Albright Industries. Her arms were laden with a stack of resumes and a coffee she could barely afford. Her lips pursed as she rehearsed her pitch for the receptionist. If she could just land an interview today, she thought, maybe things would finally turn around. But before she could reach the sleek marble desk, a commotion stopped her in her tracks. "I told you to mop this area an hour ago," a shrill voice barked. Claire turned to see an older woman in a janitor's uniform, her trembling hands clutching a mop, her face etched with lines of exhaustion. The manager, a sharply dressed woman with a cold glare, gestured dramatically toward the floor. "This is unacceptable. How dare you—" "Excuse me!" Claire's voice rang out before she realized what she was doing. All heads turned toward her, and her heart thudded in her chest. She stepped forward, her gaze locking on the manager. "There's no need to humiliate her. She's just doing her job." The manager's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you to tell me how to run my staff?" Claire faltered but then straightened her shoulders. "I'm someone who knows that basic human decency isn't optional. She's clearly working hard. Maybe you should direct that energy toward helping instead of berating her." The janitor's watery eyes met Claire's, her gratitude shining through the humiliation. The manager scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off, her heels clicking angrily against the tiles. "Thank you," the older woman whispered as she leaned on her mop. Claire smiled. "You don't deserve to be treated like that." The rest of the day was a blur of rejections and polite dismissals as Claire made her way through the city, but her mind kept drifting back to the janitor. Something about the woman's quiet dignity struck a chord in her. Later that evening, as Claire was leaving the building, she saw the janitor again. This time she was sitting on a bench outside, the evening light casting a golden glow on her worn features. Claire hesitated before walking over. "Hi," she said softly. "I hope I didn't get you in trouble earlier." The woman looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Not at all. In fact, you reminded me there are still kind people in this world. I'm Elena, by the way." "Claire," she replied, sitting beside her. Elena pulled a small tin from her pocket and offered Claire a peppermint. "You looking for work?" Claire laughed nervously. "Is it that obvious?" Elena's gaze was warm, almost maternal. "Just a hunch. Tell me what you're good at." They talked until the streetlights flickered on, Claire pouring out her dreams of working in marketing and her struggles to get a foot in the door. Elena listened intently, nodding at all the right moments. When they parted ways, Claire felt lighter, as if she'd made a friend. The next morning, Claire received a call from an unknown number. "Hello, this is Margaret from Albright Industries," the voice said crisply. "We'd like to invite you for an interview this afternoon." Claire's heart raced. I didn't apply for a position there." "Are you sure?" "We're sure," Margaret interrupted. "A recommendation was made on your behalf." Claire barely had time to process the whirlwind of events before she found herself sitting across from a panel of executives in a glass-walled conference room. Her nerves were frayed, but she managed to answer their questions with confidence. At the end of the interview, one of the executives smiled. "You've made quite an impression, Miss Thompson. Welcome to the team." When Claire left the building that day, clutching her offer letter, Elena was waiting by the bench again. This time she was smiling broadly. "You didn't," Claire said, her eyes widening. "I may have mentioned your name to someone," Elena said with a wink. "My son runs the company. He trusts my judgment." Claire's jaw dropped. "Your son?" Elena chuckled. "Graham Albright. I don't advertise it much, but yes. And I think he'll be very interested in meeting the woman who stood up for me." Claire's world tilted. She could only nod, her cheeks flaming as Elena's words sank in. Unbeknownst to her, Graham Albright had been watching the entire exchange from his corner office. His curiosity piqued. Claire adjusted the collar of her second-hand blazer as she stepped out of the elevator on her first day at Albright Industries. The sprawling office floor was a hive of activity. Keyboards clattered, phones rang incessantly, and conversations buzzed in every corner. It was a world apart from anything she had experienced before, and the magnitude of it all threatened to overwhelm her. She had barely taken 3 steps when Margaret, the poised woman who had called her for the interview, appeared at her side. "Miss Thompson," she said briskly, her sharp heels clicking on the polished floor. "Welcome. Let me show you to your desk." As Claire followed Margaret through the maze of desks and glass-walled offices, she felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes. Whispers trailed behind her like a faint breeze. She wasn't sure if they were discussing her lack of experience or the peculiar fact that she'd landed this job without even applying. Her desk was modest, but strategically placed near a panoramic window that offered a stunning view of the city. Margaret handed her a folder filled with onboarding documents. This should cover everything you need for now. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Oh, and Margaret's expression softened slightly. Mr. Albright requested to meet with you later this afternoon. Claire's stomach flipped. She nodded mutely, clutching the folder like a lifeline as Margaret disappeared into the chaos of the office. She spent the morning familiarizing herself with her tasks, but her thoughts kept drifting to Elena. The woman had been so humble, so unassuming, and yet she held the key to this massive corporation. It was surreal to think that the kindly janitor she had defended was the mother of Graham Albright, one of the most powerful men in the city. By lunchtime, Claire's nerves were frayed. She had managed to avoid conversation with her colleagues, but her reprieve ended when a man about her age approached her desk. He had dark, wavy hair and an easy smile that immediately set her at ease. "You must be the new hire," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Lucas, Marketing Department." "Claire," she replied, shaking his hand. "Let me guess," he said, leaning against her desk. "You're wondering why everyone's staring at you." She laughed nervously. "Is it that obvious?" Lucas grinned. "Don't worry about it. This place loves gossip. New faces always get the treatment, but you'll be old news by next week." His friendly demeanor helped Claire relax, and before long they were chatting about the company. Lucas shared tips on navigating office politics and gave her a rundown of the key players in the building. "Have you met Graham Albright yet?" he asked casually. "Not yet," Claire said, her voice catching slightly. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "He's a tough one to figure out, brilliant but very private. You're lucky if he even remembers your name." Claire's unease grew, but she forced a smile. "Good to know. Thanks for the heads up." When the time came for her meeting with Graham, Claire felt like she was walking into the lion's den. She smoothed her blazer for the 100th time as she stepped into his office, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. The office was a stark contrast to the bustling chaos of the main floor. It was spacious and minimalist, with sleek furniture and a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the skyline. Behind a massive oak desk sat Graham Albright. He looked up from his laptop as she entered, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment she was struck by how different he seemed from the cold, untouchable CEO she had imagined. His expression wasn't unkind, but it held an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her. "Miss Thompson," he said, rising to shake her hand. His voice was deep and measured. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Albright," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He gestured for her to sit and leaned back in his chair, studying her. "My mother speaks highly of you." Claire felt her cheeks heat. "She's a wonderful woman. I just did what anyone would have done." "Not everyone," Graham said, his gaze unwavering. "She's had her share of encounters with people who lack compassion." Claire nodded, unsure of what to say. "I'm curious," he continued. "What made you stand up for her that day?" Claire hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've seen people in my own life treated unfairly because of their circumstances. It didn't seem right to stay silent." Graham's expression softened, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "We need more people like you in this world," he said quietly. Over the next few weeks, Claire settled into her role, but her interactions with Graham lingered in her mind. Despite his initial formality, he occasionally stopped by her desk to check on her progress or ask for her input on projects. These moments were fleeting but enough to fuel the growing curiosity and undeniable attraction she felt toward him. Elena remained a constant presence in her life too. The older woman often invited Claire to lunch or slipped her little notes of encouragement. Their bond deepened, and Claire began to see Eleanor as a surrogate mother, someone who genuinely cared for her well-being. One afternoon, as they sat together in a small cafe, Eleanor gave her a knowing smile. "You like him, don't you?" Claire nearly choked on her tea. "What? No, I mean, he's my boss. That would be inappropriate." Eleanor chuckled. "I've known my son all his life. He's drawn to people who challenge him, who make him think. And you, my dear, do both." Claire's cheeks burned. "It's not like that," she insisted, but even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor might be right. The next day, Claire arrived at work to find the office abuzz with excitement. Rumors swirled about a major announcement Graham was set to make later that afternoon. Lucas stopped by her desk, grinning. "Big day, huh? Word is this could change everything." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, her curiosity piqued. "No one knows for sure, but Graham's been working on something huge. If this goes well, it could put Albright Industries on the map in a way we've never seen before." When the announcement finally came, it was nothing short of groundbreaking. Graham unveiled a new initiative aimed at making the company's technology accessible to underprivileged communities, a move that was both bold and unexpected. As the room erupted in applause, Claire couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. She caught Graham's eye from across the room, and for a brief moment their gazes locked. There was something unspoken in his expression, a connection that sent a thrill through her. But as the applause died down, the moment was shattered by a sharp voice from the back of the room. "This is a mistake," a board member declared, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're jeopardizing the company's future for a pipe dream." Graham's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "The future of this company lies in innovation and responsibility. If you can't see that, perhaps you're in the wrong place." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. As Claire watched Graham stand his ground, her admiration for him deepened. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the challenges they would face, both professionally and personally. The fallout from Graham's bold announcement at the company meeting rippled through the office like an aftershock. By the next morning, Claire could feel the tension in the air. Conversations were hushed, glances were furtive, and the usual hum of productivity seemed muted. "Did you hear about the board meeting last night?" Lucas asked as he leaned over the partition of Claire's desk. She shook her head. "No. What happened?" "They were at it for hours. Some of the senior members are furious with Graham. They think this initiative will tank the company's profits." Lucas's expression darkened. "They're even talking about removing him as CEO." Claire's chest tightened. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Lucas said grimly. "But Graham isn't the type to back down without a fight." The following days were a whirlwind of chaos and uncertainty. While Graham faced mounting pressure from the board, Claire found herself thrust into the heart of the storm. One afternoon, as she was reviewing marketing proposals, Graham appeared at her desk. "Claire," he said, his tone brisk but not unkind, "can I have a word?" She followed him to his office, her pulse quickening. Once inside, he closed the door and turned to face her, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I need your help," he said, and the weight of his words was evident in his voice. "Of course," she replied, surprised. "What can I do?" He handed her a folder. "This initiative is personal to me. My mother inspired it. She's always believed in giving back, in helping those who've been overlooked." Claire nodded, her heart swelling at the mention of Elena. "But the board needs more than ideals," he continued. "They need to see hard evidence that this will work. I want you to spearhead the campaign to win them over." Her eyes widened. "Me? You have fresh ideas, and you understand what this initiative stands for," he said firmly. "I trust you." His words sent a jolt through her. Despite the immense responsibility he was placing on her shoulders, she couldn't help but feel a spark of pride and something deeper. "I'll do my best," she promised. As Claire threw herself into the project, she faced a myriad of challenges. The marketing team was skeptical of her sudden rise in prominence, and some openly questioned her qualifications. "She's just here because of Graham," one of them muttered during a meeting, loud enough for Claire to hear. The comment stung, but she refused to let it derail her. Instead, she doubled down on her efforts, poring over data and crafting a campaign that she hoped would silence the critics. Elena remained a steady source of support. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at a small diner, Claire confided in her. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this," she admitted. "Everyone's watching me, waiting for me to fail." Eleanor reached across the table and placed a hand over Claire's. "You're stronger than you think, my dear. And Graham sees that too. Trust in yourself as much as he trusts in you." Claire smiled, her resolve strengthening. The turning point came during a critical presentation to the board. Graham stood at the head of the room, flanked by Claire and a team of analysts. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with skepticism. Claire took a deep breath as she stepped forward, clutching her notes. She began her presentation, outlining the initiative's potential impact with clarity and conviction. She presented data, testimonials, and projections, her voice steady despite the pressure. As she finished, There was a moment of silence. Then one of the board members spoke up. "This is impressive," he admitted reluctantly, "but it's still a risk." Clare met his gaze, her confidence unwavering. "Every great success starts with a risk. But this isn't just about profits. It's about creating a legacy, one that aligns with the values this company was built on." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of approval in the man's expression. Later that evening, as the team celebrated their hard-earned victory, Clare found herself alone on the office balcony. The city lights stretched out before her, and the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. "Penny for your thoughts." Graham's voice broke the silence. She turned to see him standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she said with a small smile. He stepped closer, his gaze softening. "You were incredible in there. I couldn't have done this without you." Her cheeks flushed. "I just wanted to make you proud." "You've done more than that," he said, his voice low. "You've shown me what it means to believe in something, and someone." For a moment neither of them spoke, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. But before either could say more, the sound of a phone ringing interrupted the moment. Graham glanced at his phone, his expression darkening as he answered. "What is it?" he said sharply. Clare watched as his face grew tense. When he ended the call, he turned to her, his jaw clenched. "There's been an emergency," he said. "It's my mother." They rushed to the hospital, their hearts pounding with fear. Elena had collapsed at work, and the doctors were running tests to determine the cause. When they arrived, they found her sitting upright in a hospital bed, looking pale but cheerful. "Stop fussing," she said, with a weak smile as Graham hugged her tightly. "I'm fine." But Graham wasn't convinced. "You're not fine, Mom. You shouldn't even be working. Why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well?" Eleanor sighed. "I didn't want to worry you. Besides, I enjoy my work." Graham shook his head, his frustration evident. "You shouldn't have to work at all. Let me take care of you." Eleanor placed a hand on his cheek. "You already do, my dear, in more ways than you realize." Clare stood quietly by the door, her heart aching at the sight of their bond. It was clear how much they meant to each other, and she felt a renewed sense of gratitude for Eleanor's presence in her life. As the days passed, Eleanor recovered, but the experience left a lasting impact on all of them. Graham became even more determined to see the initiative succeed, channeling his energy into the project with newfound purpose. Meanwhile, Clare found herself growing closer to him. They spent long hours working together, their professional collaboration often blurring into moments of personal connection. One evening, as they reviewed campaign strategies in his office, Graham leaned back in his chair and regarded her thoughtfully. "Clare," he said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant, "have you ever thought about what you want out of life?" The question caught her off guard. "I suppose I want what everyone does," she said slowly. "Happiness, purpose, love, though the last one's a bit trickier." He smiled faintly. "Why do you say that?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "It's just hard to find someone who sees you for who you really are, flaws and all." Graham's gaze intensified. "I think the right person would see everything, and love you all the more for it." Her breath caught, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken emotion. But before she could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. As the night wore on, Clare couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted. The weeks following Eleanor's hospitalization passed in a blur of late nights and high-stakes meetings. The initiative Graham and Clare had championed was finally gaining traction, silencing even the harshest critics on the board. Yet amidst the professional triumphs, Clare couldn't ignore the growing tension between her and Graham. Their stolen glances and lingering conversations hinted at something unspoken, but neither dared to cross the invisible line that separated them. One evening, Clare was working late in the conference room, the dim glow of the city skyline spilling through the windows. She was lost in her notes when the door opened, and Graham stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Long night?" he asked, his voice soft. Clare looked up, startled. "Oh, just trying to finalize some numbers for tomorrow's pitch." He crossed the room and sat across from her, his presence filling the space. "You've been doing incredible work, Clare." "I hope you know that," she smiled, a flicker of warmth blooming in her chest. "Thank you. That means a lot." For a moment, silence settled between them. Then Graham leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "There's something I need to say," he began, his tone hesitant. Before he could continue, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. "It's the board," he said, standing abruptly. "I have to take this." Claire nodded, trying to hide her disappointment as he left the room. The following morning, Claire arrived at work to find the office buzzing with anticipation. The final vote on the initiative was scheduled for later that day, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Eleanor had insisted on attending despite Graham's protests. "This is too important," she had said firmly. "I need to be there." As the meeting began, Claire sat beside Eleanor in the packed boardroom, her heart pounding. Graham stood at the head of the table, his commanding presence silencing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "what we decide today will define the future of this company. This initiative is more than a business strategy. It's a commitment to making a difference." He spoke with passion and conviction, outlining the plan's potential impact with the same intensity that had inspired Claire from the beginning. When he finished, the room erupted into debate. Some board members praised his vision, while others voiced concerns about the risks involved. Claire listened intently, her gaze darting between Graham and the skeptical faces around the table. Finally, the chairman called for a vote. The tension in the room was palpable as each member cast their decision. When the final tally was announced, Claire felt a surge of relief. The initiative had passed. As the room emptied, Graham turned to Claire, his expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "You did it," she replied, beaming. Before he could respond, Elena stepped forward, her eyes shining with pride. "You both did," she said warmly. The three of them shared a quiet moment of celebration before Eleanor excused herself, leaving Claire and Graham alone. "I couldn't have done this without you," Graham said, his gaze locking onto hers. Claire's heart raced. "You would have found a way," she said softly. "You always do." He took a step closer, the intensity in his eyes making her breath catch. "Claire, A loud cheer erupted from the hallway as employees celebrated the news, breaking the spell between them. Graham stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "We should join them," he said, his voice tinged with regret. Claire nodded, but as they left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been left unsaid. That evening, Eleanor invited Claire to dinner at her modest apartment. The invitation was casual, but Claire sensed there was more to it. As they sipped tea after the meal, Eleanor leaned forward, her expression serious. "You know, my son isn't as strong as he seems," she said quietly. Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor sighed. "He's spent his life carrying the weight of this company, trying to prove himself to everyone, but he's never let himself be vulnerable, until now." Claire's heart ached at the thought of Graham, so confident and composed, hiding his struggles beneath the surface. "I think you're the first person who's truly seen him," Eleanor continued, her gaze piercing. "And I think he's falling for you, whether he realizes it or not." Claire's breath hitched. "Eleanor, You don't have to say anything," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Just promise me you'll be honest with yourself. And with him." The following day, Graham called Claire into his office. She braced herself for another project discussion, but his serious expression told her this was different. "Claire," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I've been avoiding this conversation, but I can't anymore." She held her breath, her pulse racing as he continued. "These past few months you've changed the way I see the world, and myself. You've challenged me, supported me, and made me believe in things I never thought possible." He paused, searching her eyes. "I don't want to lose you, Claire, not as a colleague and not as more." The words hung in the air and Claire felt a rush of emotions. Relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of certainty. "I feel the same way," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I was scared. I didn't want to ruin what we have." He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "I think we've both spent enough time being scared." Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was tender, yet filled with the promise of something deeper. Their relationship blossomed in the weeks that followed, though they kept it private, mindful of the scrutiny they would face. Eleanor, of course, was their biggest supporter, her knowing smiles and sly comments a constant source of amusement. One afternoon, Graham surprised Claire by taking her to a quiet park on the outskirts of the city. As they strolled along the winding paths, he seemed unusually nervous. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed. He stopped beneath a sprawling oak tree, turning to face her. "There's something I need to ask you." Before she could respond, he dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Claire, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me what it means to love and be loved. I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as they kissed, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the promise of a future built on love, trust, and shared dreams. Their wedding was a simple yet beautiful affair, held in the garden of Elena's favorite park. Surrounded by friends and family, they exchanged spoke of their journey as the love that had brought them together. As they danced beneath the stars, Claire felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Graham, but for the chance encounter that had changed